Hey guys, what up? Every few days, it seems, somebody poses this question about veganism and elitism. Is veganism elitist? In what ways is this a problem? And it's peculiar to me that these are always posed in terms of cost and luxury, and perhaps the image vegans portray of themselves on social media or otherwise. And I think that's asking the wrong question and therefore coming up with the wrong answers. There is another form of elitism that I think is really worth considering in reference to veganism. What percentage of Americans were ever involved with the movement to try to make seatbelts mandatory in cars? This may seem like a bizarre example, but really it's not. In American history, you may or may not be familiar with this example, the automotive industry, the big car companies that were at the time very powerful corporations with connections to government and millions of dollars, they did not want to make seatbelts mandatory and other safety features. And there was a popular political movement. They had lawyers, they had offices, they had civil society organizations who were lobbying government and giving interviews to the news and carrying on, trying to force these automotive manufacturers to install seatbelts and a number of other changes to cars. It was a real political struggle. I don't know if even 1% of Americans were involved with that struggle. Definitely not 5%. And I don't even know what percentage of Americans cared about it. Like, it did make the nightly news every so often, that struggle got... But it brought about real, fundamental political change and really saved a significant number of lives. There's an outcome in human blood and had other economic and ethical implications. There is an ethical argument that in the United States you should have the freedom to buy a car with no seatbelts. That's a question of political freedom. And that question was answered through a real political struggle. And there is a very meaningful sense in which that struggle was carried on by an elite, or elites plural. All right? It wasn't the common working man. It wasn't the poorest of the poor. It wasn't the downtrodden farmers who rose up and forced the automotive companies to install seatbelts. Yes, I think if you look at the people involved, there's one famous politician called Ralph Nader who became famous through that struggle to make seatbelts mandatory. Guess what? It's an elite movement, and it was completely effective. Now, I'm not going to repeat examples I've already used in this channel, like Mothers Against Drunk Driving and so on. These are generally perceived as positive examples. Some are negative. You can look at the history of prohibition in the United States. If you're not from America, you may not know. The word prohibition is used to refer to alcohol being made illegal in the United States. There was a period of history when alcohol was made illegal. That wasn't just a law in the United States. That was an amendment to the Constitution, the most fundamental form of political change possible under the United States political system. Who did that? Was it the poorest of the poor? Was it 90% of the population? Was it even 5% of the population? An elite got organized, influenced government, and made tremendous, sweeping political change. These things happen. So if you ask me, is veganism elitist? Is there an elitist aspect to veganism? I think the answer is yes, but everyone is looking under the wrong rock. The crucially important elitist aspect of veganism is precisely the fact that we do not need to convert 100% of the population to bring about the changes we're seeking. We do not even need to convert 50%. Actually, we can have a huge impact with just 5%, especially if those 5% are, shall we say, the right people. Okay? Now, what do I mean by the right people? It's shocking and it's horrifying, but yeah, there is an elitist aspect to that. I mean the same sort of people who were capable of organizing a social movement to try to force car manufacturers to include safety belts, the same type of people who in the past got organized and lobbied the government to have regulations against cigarettes, safety warnings, regulations on what ingredients are in cigarettes, because some ingredients were added to make cigarettes more addictive, etc., etc. All of those kinds of things. Now, poor people can be involved in those movements, the poor and the downtrodden, the oppressed. Former homeless people like Durian Ryder can be. But yes, very often those movements really do rely on the sort of people who are in a position to employ a lawyer, or people who are lawyers themselves working pro bono. It relies on donors. It relies on advocates. That's why we call it advocacy. And organizing an elite like that can be much smaller than 5% of the population, and in a democracy can have a tremendous impact on the population. Now, I don't want this video to go on much longer, but I just mentioned I am an atheist. I'm a nihilistic atheist. But one thing that influences my thinking in this is actually my past experience with Buddhism. I was a scholar of Theravada Buddhism for many years. There are videos about that. I've written many articles on the internet, including studying the ancient scriptural language. I was a real scholar. I was not just some hippie who liked meditation or liked yoga or anything else. In Buddhism, one of the controversies that is both ancient and modern, something you find in the ancient philosophy, but that people still talk about today, other religions like Christianity often attacks Buddhism, criticizes Buddhism, by claiming that Buddhism is elitist. And one of the things that's interesting about Theravada Buddhism is that it's different. Christians are very big on saying that Christianity is for everyone. It's got to save everybody's soul. They've got to go out and preach to people, even if people are severely mentally retarded. Christians will try to get these mentally retarded people to participate in the rituals and in some sense believe in this doctrine so they can be saved and their souls can go to heaven. And in Theravada Buddhism, we don't do that. Theravada Buddhism, maybe especially in the ancient texts, there was a recognition, this is a philosophy. And it's not for everybody. And it's not even going to help everybody. And you know what? Exceptionally intelligent people, exceptionally educated people, and yes, when you're talking about kings and princes, exceptionally powerful people, it's actually more important that they learn about this philosophy, or that they learn about it first, if this philosophy is going to have a future, if it's going to survive. And that is a difference from religions or social movements that focus endlessly on the poorest of the poor, the downtrodden, or on the masses in some abstract sense. When people talk about the masses, they think they mean everybody, but they usually really mean nobody. They talk about the masses, but they're only talking about the tiny number of people who show up at left-wing political events. This is a contradiction we're all familiar with in life. Yes, within my lifetime, in the next 10 years, in the next 20 years, elitism is a factor in veganism, and it is partly a problem. We do need to see vegan outreach that focuses on helping the poor, but before we can even get to that, we have to be at the level of having organizations that can help the poor. And that's where the Christians and the Buddhists beat the crap out of us. There is no vegan foundation in the world today that can help the poor or that actually does. And there are hundreds and thousands of Christian, Buddhist, even Muslim charities that really do reach out and help the poor. If you want to help the poor, you first got to be in that position to help yourself, right? It's possible I'll see that within my lifetime. But obviously, people for the ethical treatment of animals, they can't go out and feed the starving. None of the vegan organizations can. And the scale and organization and credibility and wealth you would need to have for a vegan organization to do that, it's worth thinking about. Maybe it's worth dreaming about. Maybe it's worth planning for. Maybe we should make it happen. But actually, that type of outreach to the poorest of the poor, you want to take sacks of rice to starving people in Southeast Asia and Africa, and to bring vegan food to the game of international humanitarian aid, wonderful. That's a wonderful idea. But before you get to that, actually you're already dealing with the kind of elitism I've been describing, because you first need to form the foundation. You first need to do the fundraising, etc., before you can start doing that kind of outreach and aid, right? Advocacy itself involves elitism of a kind.